We'll wait just a moment for people to trickle in out of the waiting room.
Well, this must have been difficult to rearrange everything.
Everybody was uh, very kind and patient in the process, and so far I think it's worked out great. Um, it's not lacks some of the social aspects that camp previously did, but everybody's making the best of the situation, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, folks. Well, today we are excited to have another guest scholar to talk to you. Today it is Walter Russell Mead, who is a Distinguished Fellow in Strategy and Statesmanship at the Hudson Institute and the James Clark Chase Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College, and a columnist with the Wall Street Journal. He had an excellent column about Biden's foreign policy just a few days ago that I encourage you to read. But most importantly to you, he's the author of one of the most read, if not the most read piece of evidence, Mead 92. And today he's going to talk to you about foreign affairs, economic interdependence, and answer a few questions. So the floor is yours, good sir.
All right, great. Well, it's good to be here. I'm sorry we're not all in the same room and don't have a chance to talk face to face, but we do what we have to do. So I bring you greetings from Washington, D.C., as some people call it, the swamp. Those of us who live here really find that name kind of hurtful. And we would suggest that you describe our city as an ecologically diverse tropical wetland. It's a much nicer way to talk about our beautiful town. In any case, it's good to have so many debaters together virtually. Debate is, I think, one of the most important things that anybody can do in high school. It certainly was for me. I was on our school debating team, and it's actually kind of scary because in our school, the boys' boarding school, about 200 kids, attendance at interscholastic debates was required. And so if you did well, everybody would clap and cheer. And if you made a mistake or you weren't that impressive, everyone you know would remind you for weeks afterwards of the various stupid things you had said or done. I hope your debating lives are less stressful, but I did learn a lot from that. And some of the skills I learned back then, are skills I still use as a columnist. So the work that you do in high school debate, I think is work that's going to last you a long time. And of course, it's kind of fun. Arguing with people is really one of the more entertaining ways to pass your time. And in debate, you can get rewarded for it. So, as debaters, you need to understand how things are connected, how political decisions can affect economic outcomes, how a 0.5% jump in the sales tax can lead to thermonuclear war. You need to understand the relations between domestic political debates and international events. And again, you got to understand these relationships vice versa. How does the international situation impact domestic policy debates, and so on. So what I'd like to do today is spend our time together talking about the big picture of what's happening in our world today. And it's very much related to this 1992, was it, article that I did where I talked about thermonuclear war. Is it 92 or 93? I can't remember. A long time ago, in any case. Most of you were probably not born then. But the observations that I was making then, that the world economy was not on a solid foundation, and that economic trouble could and had in the past lead to extremely destructive conflicts, and that under the conditions existing in the 1990s and still today, those conflicts could become nuclear and massively destructive. That's all still true. But this is part of something bigger and something that affects your lives, and I think will affect the issues that you need to study and think about in more ways than simply this linkage between economic crisis and thermonuclear war. So what am I talking about? I guess the simplest way to put it is this. The thing that you all have to remember about the world that we live in today is that the end of the world is near. Now, I don't mean by that the world is going to end tomorrow necessarily, although it could, but rather that we're in a situation, a world situation in which there are a number of ways that life as we know it could come to an abrupt end. And there are many paths in politics and policy, or simply bad luck, that could lead to that sort of an outcome. And that's in human history, that's both new and it's important. And we need to learn how to think about this effectively so that we can act effectively and think clearly at a time when that's more important than ever. So if we go back in world history a little bit, the idea of the end of the world has always been part of people's thinking. In his Hindu cosmology, there's cycles of creation and destruction. The Vikings looked forward to the battle at the end of time when the frost giants would defeat the gods and Valhalla would go down in flames. In Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there is this idea of the end of the world coming when God comes back in some way to judge people and to establish kind of eternal, just, peaceful system under God, that's directly under God, that doesn't necessarily physically bring an end to this planet or this universe, but is an end to the world that we've known, the world of ordinary history. And people will sometimes use the phrase end of history and end of the world to mean very similar things. Until the 1700s or so, when people might look around them and say, "Uh-oh, the end of the world is near." They might say, "Okay, the Black Death is killing everybody. A plague has come and we could destroy us all." Or they might look and see the wars of religion in Europe after the Reformation, or when the calendar, reached up to the year 1000. There were monks who thought, "Oh my goodness, this means 1000. This is obviously going to be the end." But when people thought about the end of the world, it was not as a result of anything people did. The world was sort of safe from us. We could kill each other, we could make trouble, we could do all kinds of horrible things, but we couldn't bring an end to human existence and human society, and we couldn't fundamentally alter the terms of our lives. But at the time of the European Enlightenment in the 1700s, as people started looking at the way technology was becoming more powerful, there was more economic growth, there was more education, people were traveling more. They could see actually that that history seemed to be moving in a direction. It was no longer just one thing after another. One generation comes, one generation goes, but we're pretty much where we were before. No, there seemed to be movement, and this movement, as they saw it, was pointing upward to a future where technology would eliminate poverty and starvation, where it would cure diseases and extend the human lifespan. And as this happened, human societies would become more enlightened. And so there would be less war, ultimately no war. Technological and scientific progress would bring moral progress, and that would change the way people lived so fundamentally that we would be in a very different world. And in fact, if you think about it, they were saying that what religious people had thought only God could do fundamentally transformed the human condition for the better through the Last Judgment or whatever it might be. Now humanity could do it ourselves through progress and technology. Um, in the 1800s, this idea continued to spread as science and progress continued. And Karl Marx actually took it a step farther and, no longer said, well, science and technology are making the world a better place. And if we just hang out long enough, we're going to live in a utopia. He said, no, we can build a utopia. We can study the laws of history, the laws of science, laws of society. And by acting on those laws, we can bring about the end of history. We can get rid of war, we can get rid of oppression, we can get rid of injustice, and we can build this bright, new, shining world of abundance, longevity, freedom, and we can do it ourselves. So human beings acting together according to a plan could transform human history into something radically different and significantly better. Well, this was very encouraging, and lots of people were swept away by this dream. And it's, we're not going to sort of get into how that did and didn't work out for them, but it's worth noting for our story that things did not. The story of world history began to look a little bit more complicated and maybe a little darker, particularly with World War I in 1914, where you had all the wealth and the technological strength of these European societies turned into this massive, bloody, horrible war. And the war went on so long and was so destructive, and the social consequences of the war were so great that people could imagine that a future war could lead to the destruction of human civilization. That that science and technology might not be the agents of rescuing humanity from the blood and mess and misery of ordinary life, but actually could be the thing that brought the whole human adventure to an end. Now, this frightening view of the human situation became far more sort of impressive and realistic. And I'd say the years 1945 was a big turning point in this. Because two things happened. Again, I'm talking mostly about the West, but they had impacts in other parts of the world, and often there were sort of parallel developments in other parts of the world that pointed in the same direction. The first thing in 1945 was, at this point, with the liberation of Nazi-occupied Europe, you began to get really hard evidence of what had gone on under the Nazis, the Holocaust in particular, where we discovered that in this very enlightened country of Germany, which was one of the pioneers of science and education and all these technological things that were going to bring humanity to this better future, none of that had protected either the Germans or the Jews and others among them from this unbelievable dark evil, the desire to kill. And so you have the systematic destruction of a whole people, the cold-blooded murder. There's a deliberate gassing of 6-year-old children in large numbers. It's kind of just horror. And at the same, so this is telling you, look, that Enlightenment idea that science and technology were going to cure humanity's moral failings and lead us to a better life, that suddenly does not look particularly probable. But at the same time, you have 1945, the explosion of atom bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the Americans, ending World War II in Japan. And so now we see that this same humanity that we have discovered its deep flaws and sort of murderous inner nature cannot be tamed or controlled by scientific progress or the Enlightenment. But that same scientific progress and the Enlightenment has placed these weapons of ultimate destruction into those hands. So the end of the world no longer looks like some weird religious myth. It no longer looks like some sort of, fantasy of a diseased imagination. It's perfectly possible to see, particularly after the Soviet Union gets nuclear weapons in 1949, I believe, that a nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States might not just wipe out those two countries, but could wipe out human life around the planet. When I was 10 years old, 1962, there was the Cuba Missile Crisis. And during that time, people actually did think that nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States was very close. And so you would do drills about, how to protect yourself in the case of an atom bomb attack. And I remember we used to, I guess I was in the fifth grade that year. We would stand around on the playground at recess and ask whether our town, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, was going to be one of the first towns attacked when the first wave of Soviet nuclear missiles. These are 10-year-old kids. And we were sort of hoping we would be, because what we knew was that the ones who died quick in the explosion, those were the lucky ones. Then the ones who survived that initial wave would have radiation poisoning, but the whole world would be slowly dying and they would be horribly trapped in it. So those are 10-year-old kids. The end was near. You see, the end of the world was something that was very much present. Now, with the end of the Cold War in 1989, a lot of people took a deep sigh of relief. Soviet Union wasn't pointing missiles at the U.S. anymore. We weren't pointing missiles at them. We can get back to normal. We don't have to worry about the end of the world. We don't have to worry that human action could somehow trigger some uncontrollable sort of cascade of devastation and destruction. But very, very soon after the end of the Cold War, these fears began to creep back in different ways. Maybe the first one, and I'm sure it's one that many of you as high schoolers have encountered, is the fear that climate change could not only just sort of cause some economic trouble and some floods and hurricanes and things like that, but that, this could set off a kind of a cascade of destruction that as the climate changes, some countries would lose the ability to feed themselves, vast migrations, wars. These wars could escalate, or that the climate change could reach a kind of a tipping point, and you could go into this sort of feedback loop where it just keeps getting hotter and hotter. People talk about a runaway greenhouse effect and condition Venus, where climate change destroys human civilization, destroys life on Earth. So again, the end of the world began to draw near. After the 9/11 attacks, when we saw a new scale of what terrorists could do, people began to think, well, suppose they got a hold of nuclear weapons or biological weapons or chemical weapons. And so suddenly, once again, we began to live in this very, very disturbing world. In 2008, with the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, when the entire global economy shook, again, the fears that economic destabilization, Mead 93, whatever, economic destabilization could destroy the peace of the world and put us on a course toward disaster were triggered. And some would argue, in fact, that we're now in a slow-moving version of that mainland China in 2008, 2009, came to the conclusion that the financial crisis demonstrated that the American system in the United States and capitalism itself were in their death throes. And so that the time had come for China to move much more assertively in international relations. And that began this kind of period of increasing tension between China and its neighbors, China and the United States, that many people would now say is approaching the level of Cold War II. Well, it's, some of these things are hard to figure out, but very much there's a trend of rising fear, of concern that yet again we could be in a world that's defined by a broad rivalry between two nuclear powers, each with the ability to destroy life on Earth. And there are a lot of other ways that big rivalry could make smaller problems harder to solve, and in that way increase the potential causes for war. I hope I'm cheering everyone up. I hope you're all having a really good day. I know this is just what you need in the middle of a pandemic. But there are other elements of this sort of darker picture that begin to emerge. One is it's no longer, nuclear weapons are scary, but I would say that biological weapons are scarier still. We're now seeing with this pandemic just how much devastation a virus can reach. And this is a virus that is only, it only kills something like 1% of the people that it infects, maybe smaller. We're still not quite sure. But imagine a virus that was genetically designed to kill, genetically designed to kill people of a certain racial genetic makeup, or that a country might develop vaccines for an engineered virus and then release the virus and vaccinate its own people, and then say to the rest of the world, well, you got to do X and Y and Z if you want us to give you the vaccine, otherwise, bye-bye. So the end of the world keeps getting closer. Now, again, I want to emphasize that I'm not saying that we can know that the world is going to end tomorrow, next week, next month, or even in the next 50 years. We don't know that. Humanity managed to kind of, sort of make its way through the Cold War without a nuclear interchange between the Soviet Union and the United States. There's no automatic force here pushing these potential problems to become actual civilization busting conflicts. But the potential can't be denied. You can't say to somebody who's worrying about these things, oh, don't be a child. There's nothing to worry about. Everything is fine. It's not fine. These dangers are real. And by the way, your generation is going to be living in the face of these things. And you're not only going to need to think about how do you conduct high school debate against this kind of background, but you need to think about, how should you be thinking about politics? How should you be thinking about your career, your life choices in the light of this? So we are in a kind of time that humanity has not experienced before. And in addition to these Grim Reaper sorts of thoughts, we're also at a time of escalating changes that are not necessarily directly related to these. Many of you, I'm sure, have studied the problems of, both the possibilities and the problems of automation. We might have self-driving cars in 5 or 10 years that would, on the one hand, could reduce traffic deaths, and for a lot of us would mean a lot less time stuck idly behind a wheel, could change the way we commute, the way we live in all kinds of fantastic ways, reduce emissions. But also, there are an awful lot of jobs, delivery trucks, bus drivers, all kinds of jobs would disappear as well. And so we're living in, and when people lose jobs, that's not, on a large scale, that's not just bad luck for one or two people. It changes society, it changes politics. All those people out of jobs or afraid that technology will destroy their jobs, they don't just kind of sit there passively accepting their problems. They want change. They want to organize and have people pass laws and have policies that will ensure them or protect them or stop the march of technology, whatever it may be. So automation, the changes, other changes in the way artificial intelligence shifts, the kind of a surveillance state we've seen the government in mainland China develop. All of these sorts of things are happening over here, even while in the background, we have this slowly, ominously growing threat of a disastrous culmination of these trends. So, what do we do? Well, I'm going to say we're going to have to think clearly and act wisely, and develop ourselves so that we become the kind of people who can be responsible and constructive in times like this and take action that can lead people toward a better path. I would say, to return to where I started from, one of the best places to do that is in the world of high school debate, where you learn to sort of think about the consequences of actions, about the connections between one policy and another, think about cause and effect. So what you guys are doing is you're preparing yourselves to maybe, who knows, help save the human race. But in any case, I hope I've cheered you up and given you all kinds of exciting things to think about, and maybe even a couple of new debate cards that you can use as evidence in the future. So, are there questions or comments? Kurt, do you want to handle this?
Yep, sure. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to put them into the Q&A. And I guess I'll start with your column. I think it was on Tuesday. Can you enlighten us on kind of your thoughts about Biden's foreign policy?
Well, it's I've had the chance in the last few weeks to talk to Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken, who were two of Vice President Biden's closest advisors. And what I'm hearing from both of them, really, is that a Biden administration is going to try to put things right, as they would say it. They would say the Trump administration sort of has walked away from partnerships like NATO, like the transatlantic relationship, World Trade Organization, Paris Climate Accords. And what really needs to happen is not a reinvention of things, not some radical new shift in politics, but the United States has to get back to doing the kind of foreign policy that it was doing, by and large, under presence of both parties, going back in some ways to the end of World War II. I think that's the plan. How it works out in action will be interesting to see.
Okay. Our next question is, do you see economic interdependence and MAD, mutually assured destruction, as effective deterrent strategies?
Okay, well, I'm sorry to say that I think that that neither of them is 100% sure, but that MAD is probably a better bet than economic interdependence. I like economic interdependence. I think it does make war less likely. You can look back in the 1800s and the United States and Britain at the time, did not like each other very much on the whole. And we almost every 5 to 10 years there would be some kind of a war crisis between the United States and Britain. But after 1812, the War of 1812, we never actually got into war. And one of the reasons was that every time, war was close, a bunch of businessmen would rush into the office of the British Prime Minister in 10 Downing Street and say, "Are you mad? Do you realize what would happen if we had a war with the Americans? Do you realize what would happen to all of our investments in the United States? Where do you think we would be getting our wheat from if we had a war with the United States, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." And meanwhile, over in the United States, people were going into the president's office saying, "Oh, what kind of an idiot are you? Do you have any idea what would happen to the American banking system, to the stock market, to our companies, to our exports if we had a war with England? What kind of a nut are you? Stop it! Stop it!" All right, and that's a powerful force. So powerful that I think his name was Angell, Nathan Angell, Robert Angell, wrote a book in 1910 where he said that war is really not going to happen again because war is so economically destructive that no rational person would have a war. And since everyone is basically rational, the leaders of great nations have to be rational. How do you get into office if you're not rational? Then we really, war is a thing of the past more and more. And this was a huge bestseller and a very influential book up until 1914, when for some reason sales of the book just fell off a cliff. But this idea that economic interdependence can prevent war, thank goodness it prevented World War I. Thank goodness it prevented World War II. So I'm not confident in that. Mutually assured destruction, the gun at the head, is, perhaps more effective, but we've seen people do some very stupid things.
All right, well, thank you. Another question is, do you think that climate change increases the propensity for the chances of a nuclear war?
It could. It could. Anything that destabilizes countries' governments can lead to people making rash choices. So if you were to have a degree of climate change that, say, led to some kind of massive political crisis in the United States, or the climate change caused some kind of massive economic crisis that then had a big impact on politics, yeah, I think things could happen. I would say that at least as I understand it, the IPCC projections are not really showing that level of destabilization. So bit of a judgment call there.
We had another question. I think the kids were fascinated by your rhetoric on bioterror and bioweapons. Have you written any articles about this other than your April 2020 article that was in the Wall Street Times or Wall Street Journal?
I think that's the place to look for that. I may come back to this subject because I think it's a big one.
All right, well, keep an eye out for an article about bioterror. So one thing, this year's topic is about criminal justice reform. So it's usually it solves a very proximate problem, which is just injustice that might affect just a handful of people. And obviously, we like to rush to nuclear war on one side. So how do you think, how is just the debate that we constantly have, at what rate would you be more concerned about a nuclear war happening versus saving a few people's lives from death row? If that makes sense.
I'm not quite sure.
So often in debate, we'll have the one half is to, or affirmative is to end the death penalty. at the federal level. So as of now, I would save just a handful of lives. But then the negative obviously finds a way to say that that causes thermonuclear war. Uh, is this something, would you, just as a scholar, think that there's any credibility to that negative position, or just kind of default to the we should just save a few lives when we can?
Well, I'd have to look at the reasoning that people get from eliminating the federal death penalty to thermonuclear war. Because I honestly just don't. It's hard for me to imagine a chain of causality. I mean, anything is imaginable. You know, I don't know if the debaters know that old thing about for want of a nail, the shoe was lost, the horseshoe was lost. For want of the shoe, the horse was lost. For want of the horse, the rider was lost. For want of the message, for want of the rider, the message was lost. For want of the message, the battle was lost. And for want of the battle, the kingdom was lost. And all for a rusty nail. So, you can build a sort of consequential chain of reasoning from almost any point A to any point Z. But I have to say that some of them seem more probable than others. And I would be surprised to see a credible line of argument going from abolition of the federal death penalty to thermonuclear war.
All right. Well,
It
thank you.
surprised me. I mean, I'm open to new things.
Um, our our last question comes from Samuel, who asks, you mentioned that some people actively denied the thesis that war could happen because of various factors. Do you think that the promotion of these ideas are actively bad? Or do you think that these people are incorrect about the theories that they have might be espousing and are not actively harmful?
Well, I think it's always better to be right than to be wrong about things, and that when people have misleading ideas, they are misled, and so they may then make decisions that with a better understanding they wouldn't make, and decisions have consequences. So I think we can certainly look back in the 1930s, and there were a lot of people who were far too confident that there would never be another war like World War One. And so they delayed rearming and were a little slow to recognize some of the dangers that were taking shape. So yes, I would say, it's important to make your decisions based on sound ideas and sound logic.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time and sharing your thoughts with us. We we hope to be reading evidence from you another 30 years into the future, and maybe even citing that same article from the early 90s. Uh, so everybody keep an eye out for more articles by Walter Russell Mead. You can find him on Twitter at WR Mead, and he will continue to be prolific, I imagine, and we'll keep reading his cards. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Bye.